The flashing red and blue lights lit up my entire street, bouncing off garage doors and manicured lawns as neighbors peeked through blinds. And in the center of it all stood Karen, arms crossed, lips pursed, convinced she had finally caught me. She pointed at my parked car like it was a stolen artifact. Officers approached cautiously, until they realized who they were dealing with. Because Karen didn't know, yet, that the vehicle she was trying to seize belonged to the traffic cop who trained half the department. And tonight, her little stunt was about to backfire harder than she could have imagined. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe for more real-life justice stories where entitled people push too far, and the truth hits back harder than karma ever could. The neighborhood was unusually still that morning, the kind of silence that hangs right before trouble surfaces. Dew clung to my car windshield in silver streaks, reflecting the soft sunrise cutting across the cul-de-sac. For years, I had lived quietly among these carefully trimmed lawns and white picket reputations, never causing problems, never drawing attention. The irony, of course, was that my entire career revolved around attention, details, patterns, the subtle wrongs most drivers never realized were wrongs at all. Being a traffic cop made observation second nature, but I had never expected I'd need that skill set in my own driveway. My patrol car wasn't a marked unit. It was an unmarked department-issued sedan, registered under my name, legally authorized, and routinely parked at home during off-duty rotation. Most neighbors knew I worked in enforcement, but I never advertised the specifics. I kept things simple, professional, peaceful. But peace has a way of provoking certain types, especially people like Karen. She had joined our HOA board only 3 months earlier, yet she behaved as if she were the founding architect of the entire suburb. Her presence lingered everywhere. Clipped notices slid under doors, passive-aggressive emails about community standards, and her relentless patrolling of the neighborhood on foot, searching for violations with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. People whispered, but no one pushed back. They preferred harmony, even if it meant tolerating her petty crusades. My first run-in with her had been trivial. She claimed my trash bins were 2 inches too far right of the designated placement. I dismissed it politely. She marked my file with a warning anyway. Then came complaints about the color of my porch light, the angle of my hedges, the visibility of my house numbers, none carrying any actual consequence. They were attempts to provoke, to control, to assert dominance. I stayed silent. I always stayed silent, until the morning she targeted my car. I had just poured my coffee when I heard footsteps outside, deliberate and forceful, accompanied by the familiar rhythm of a phone camera recording. The tone in her voice, sharp, breathless, triumphant, carried straight through the windows even before I opened the door. There it is. Unauthorized, unregistered, illegally parked, she declared to no one and everyone at once. Karen stood inches from the bumper of my unmarked vehicle, taking photos from every angle. Her bright HOA badge hung around her neck like a sheriff's star she believed gave her actual power. She didn't acknowledge me emerging. She was too intoxicated by the illusion of catching a criminal. I approached slowly, not wanting to escalate anything. But escalation was Karen's natural state. "This vehicle is not authorized to be parked on community grounds," she announced loudly, turning her phone toward me like a recorded threat. "It violates HOA Section 12, Article 4. Commercial or unidentified government vehicles are prohibited." I calmly explained that the car was registered, privately assigned, and exempt from the rule she was twisting. But Karen wasn't listening. She had already written out a citation, on a homemade HOA ticket sheet she personally designed, and slapped it against my windshield with exaggerated authority. "This is your final warning," she declared, stepping back dramatically as if expecting applause. I considered brushing it off. Another petty nuisance. Another fabricated rule. But her eyes held something new that morning, a spark of determination that hinted this wouldn't end with a warning. By noon, the HOA inbox was flooded with her accusations. I heard from neighbors that she had been visiting doors, convincing people that I was hiding a dangerous, suspicious vehicle. I would have ignored it, but then came the knock on my door, a harsh pounding that rattled through the hallway. I opened it to find 2 local police officers standing on the porch, their expressions a blend of confusion and protocol. Behind them, Karen hovered anxiously, gripping a stack of printed screenshots she had taken of my car. She stepped forward before the officers could speak. "There," she said, thrusting the papers in their hands. "I'm reporting an illegally operated police vehicle parked on private HOA property. I demand it be towed immediately." The lead officer looked at her, then at the car, then back at me. Recognition flickered across his face. He had worked under my training years ago, one of the recruits who sat in my classes absorbing everything about traffic enforcement and departmental procedure. "Ma'am," he began carefully, "this vehicle is properly registered. It belongs to—" "Don't defend him," she snapped. "He's hiding behind fake authority. I know the law." But she didn't. Not even close. The officers exchanged a subtle glance, one that carried a mix of disbelief and restrained irritation. They had clearly encountered HOA zealots before, but this level of entitlement was new even to them. I stayed quiet, letting them process the situation professionally. But Karen wasn't finished. She marched toward my driveway, demanding the officers follow her, pointing aggressively at the tires as if she had uncovered evidence of a federal crime. And then, she made the mistake that changed everything. She radioed dispatch herself, using a personal emergency line she had absolutely no authorization for, claiming she had discovered a rogue officer impersonating law enforcement. The officers stiffened instantly. One turned toward her with a sharpness that made her finally hesitate. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, "you may want to step back." For the first time since she moved into the community, Karen's confidence faltered. She didn't understand yet, but she was seconds away from learning the full weight of the laws she thought she could manipulate. A silence swept over the street as neighbors gathered at windows and doors, sensing a shift. And then came the moment that would ignite everything that followed. The officer turned toward me and said, loud enough for every watching neighbor, "Sir, should we brief her on your position, or would you like to handle it yourself?" Karen froze. Everything inside her defiance stopped cold. And just like that, the real story began. The stillness that followed the officer's question stretched across the street like a taut wire, ready to snap. Karen's expression faltered, her confidence draining from her face as if someone had punctured the balloon of authority she carried everywhere. The officers stood calmly, their posture firm but controlled, waiting for my decision. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stepped forward slowly, letting the weight of the pause settle into the air. The neighborhood had rarely seen confrontation, and now the entire cul-de-sac seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a truth they hadn't known they were missing. Karen attempted to steady herself, straightening her HOA badge as though it could reinforce the shaky structure of her confidence. Her eyes darted between the officers and me, searching for a foothold, a rule, a shred of justification to cling to. She had built her identity around being untouchable, and now the ground beneath her was dissolving. The silence pressed harder, and she finally spoke with a voice that wavered more than she intended. I'm simply enforcing community regulations," she said, her tone teetering between fear and indignation. "This neighborhood follows strict guidelines. Vehicles like that are disruptive." But even she didn't sound convinced of her own reasoning anymore. The lead officer stepped forward, his arms folding behind him with trained composure. "Ma'am, the vehicle in question is legally authorized and exempt from HOA restrictions. The owner is a sworn officer with departmental clearance. Your report is unfounded." His voice remained respectful, but the firmness beneath it made Karen recoil slightly, as though realizing she had misjudged the entire situation. Her breath caught. "You mean?" she whispered. I finally spoke, the calmness in my voice cutting through her unraveling facade. "Yes, Karen. I'm a traffic enforcement officer. I've worked with this department for over a decade. The car you tried to seize is my assigned unit. And you just called emergency services to report me as an impersonator." The color drained from her cheeks. She stumbled back a step, her composure slipping like sand through her fingers. The neighbors watched with widening eyes, their curiosity transforming into astonishment. Until now, they had seen only fragments of Karen's behavior. Petty complaints, exaggerated enforcement, relentless emails, but never anything that crossed into legal territory. Today, however, she had crossed that boundary with full force. She clung to her folder of accusations, the pages trembling slightly in her hand. I didn't know, she said weakly. Your car isn't marked. I thought. That's not an excuse, the officer replied. Accessing emergency lines without cause is a serious misuse of resources. Her lips parted in protest, but the words refused to form. I was only trying to keep the community safe, she attempted, though the conviction she usually carried was missing entirely. But the street echoed with a truth she couldn't deny anymore. Her actions had always been about control, not safety. The second officer approached her. His expression neutral, but the tension in his posture unmistakable. Ma'am, we're going to need you to step aside while we gather information. You've made severe allegations. Karen clutched her badge, the symbol she believed granted her authority, but it no longer held any power. She looked smaller now, diminished in a way the community had never seen. The officers guided her toward the sidewalk, giving her space but maintaining a clear boundary between her and the vehicle she had tried to command out of existence. As the officers documented the incident, neighbors quietly drifted outside. Doors cracked open. Feet shuffled along driveways. People whispered, their eyes tracing between Karen and me as though finally seeing the situation for what it was. A few offered nods of silent support, the kind that acknowledged the shared frustration many had endured. For years, they had tolerated her overbearing presence because they feared conflict more than inconvenience. But now, the spell had broken. The officers asked me a few clarifying questions, and I answered calmly, aware that every detail mattered. The more Karen heard, the more she seemed to shrink behind her stack of printed screenshots. She flipped through them helplessly, as though still searching for evidence that might justify her actions. But each photo only highlighted how far she had stretched her interpretation of the rules to fit her personal crusade. Finally, the lead officer closed his notepad with a sharp snap that returned everyone's attention to him. All right, he said. We've heard both sides. We'll be filing a departmental report regarding misuse of emergency services. Additional measures may follow after review. Karen gasped. A report? Against me? It's standard procedure, he said. Especially in cases of false allegations involving law enforcement. Her breath trembled. Her control, once anchored in fear and intimidation, was dissolving with every official word. But then something shifted, something subtle but dangerous. Her eyes hardened again, her jaw tightening as she stepped toward me, ignoring the officer's warnings to keep her distance. She lowered her voice, but the intensity in her tone carried through the air like frost. This isn't over, she whispered sharply. The HOA has bylaws. Authority. I will not be embarrassed like this in my own neighborhood. The threat was quiet, but unmistakably real. Before the officers could intervene, she turned sharply and stormed back toward her house, clutching her folder as though she could rebuild her power from its tattered papers. Her door slammed behind her, echoing through the cul-de-sac with a force that made several neighbors flinch. The officers exchanged glances and approached me one last time. We'll handle the paperwork, the lead officer said. But be careful with her. People like that don't admit mistakes. They escalate. And in that moment, I felt the shadows lengthen around the street, not from the setting sun, but from the storm I knew was still coming. Karen wasn't retreating. She was regrouping. And her next move would prove far more dangerous. Night settled over the neighborhood with an uneasy heaviness, the kind that makes every shadow feel sharper, every quiet corner more watchful. Karen's door had remained shut since the officers left, but the silence surrounding her home carried its own kind of warning. Some people calmed down after confrontation. Others simmered. Karen simmered. And simmering people didn't retreat quietly. They prepared their next strike. I tried to settle into my evening routine, but a faint tension lingered in the air, the kind that prickled beneath the skin. Even inside my home, something felt off, as if the walls themselves sensed a shift in the neighborhood's balance. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was anticipation, an awareness that the encounter earlier had only been the beginning, not the conclusion. The first sign came just past 8 o'clock. A hollow thunk echoed against my front door, subtle but deliberate. When I opened it, a neatly folded envelope lay at the center of the porch, slid with such precision it felt rehearsed. The crisp HOA letterhead glared up at me, its glossy crest illuminated by the porch light. The envelope was not sealed. Karen wanted it found quickly. Inside was a formal violation notice, printed in bold black type, accusing me of disrupting community harmony by creating a hostile environment for HOA leadership. Another citation claimed my unmarked vehicle posed an ongoing safety concern. A third alleged refusal to cooperate with community authority. Each line twisted the earlier incident into a narrative where she was the victim, and I was an aggressor. It wasn't surprising. Karen was predictable in one way. When cornered, she constructed her own reality. I set the papers aside, recognizing them for what they were, fabricated retaliation. But retaliation had a way of spreading fast under her influence. By morning, the effects of her campaign became painfully clear. As I stepped outside for work, I noticed every neighbor's expression carried a different emotion: hesitation, sympathy, uncertainty. Some avoided eye contact, unsure how to navigate the rift growing between me and the HOA. Others offered faint nods of solidarity, subtle gestures acknowledging their awareness of Karen's tactics. Word had spread overnight, carried through email threads, whispered conversations, and Karen's relentless determination to rewrite the previous day's events. On my windshield lay another notice, this one laminated, taped firmly, and undeniably placed by Karen herself. It demanded my attendance at an emergency HOA violation hearing, scheduled for the upcoming weekend. The language was forceful, the tone accusatory, the intent unmistakable. She wanted a public reckoning. But what struck me wasn't the threat itself, it was the level of organization behind it. Karen had mobilized the board quickly, pulling them into her vision of restoring her authority. She was wounded, embarrassed, desperate to reclaim control. And desperate people often reached for drastic measures. As I drove to work, the weight of the situation settled deeper. Karen wasn't merely targeting me, she was attempting to weaponize the entire HOA structure against someone who had challenged her narrative. She believed the rules belonged to her. She believed the neighborhood belonged to her. And now, she believed justice should bend in her favor. At the department, I reviewed the report filed by the officers involved in the incident. Their account was clear, unbiased, and supported by departmental procedures. But HOA politics didn't rely on clarity or procedure, they relied on perception. And perception could be distorted by loud voices and persistent claims. During patrol, the thought lingered, Karen wasn't finished escalating. She would push further until something, or someone, stopped her. The question wasn't whether she would act again. It was how far she would go. By the time I returned home late that afternoon, subtle shifts in the neighborhood confirmed her ongoing influence. The HOA newsletter had been updated, featuring a new section titled Community Safety Concerns. Though my name wasn't mentioned directly, the wording unmistakably referred to my situation. Phrases like unauthorized activity and unidentified vehicles were sprinkled throughout, painting a vague but troubling picture for residents who hadn't witnessed the truth. Children playing on driveways paused when I drove past, their parents ushering them back toward garages with uneasy glances. The atmosphere had changed entirely. Where peace once lingered, now suspicion took root. Karen had succeeded in planting seeds of doubt, and she had done it quickly. As evening approached, movement near Karen's house caught my attention. Through the dimming light, I saw her walking door to door again, clipboards in hand, gathering signatures. It was clear what she was doing, building support for a motion to force the removal of what she called a threatening presence in the community. Even at a distance, the intensity of her mission radiated outward, driven by a personal vendetta she had now disguised as a neighborhood safety initiative. I watched from my porch, not in fear but in recognition. People like Karen derived power not from truth, but from momentum. And she was gathering momentum fast. Just as I turned to head inside, another detail caught my eye, something far more concerning. A tow truck crawled slowly down the street, its engine humming with steady purpose. It stopped in front of my driveway, lingering far longer than simple curiosity could justify. The driver leaned forward, examining my car with an interest that didn't feel accidental. My pulse tightened. Karen wasn't waiting for the hearing. She was making another move. I stepped off the porch, approaching the truck with controlled calm. Before I reached it, the driver rolled down his window. "Evening," he said casually. Got a call about a vehicle in violation of private community code. Said it was unauthorized. Wanted it removed immediately. Karen had done it again. But this time, she wasn't misusing emergency services. She was misusing private contractors, manipulating systems outside official oversight. The driver shrugged. Look, I'm not towing anything until the request's verified. But the lady was insistent. The word lingered heavily. Insistent. Karen's favorite state of being. As the truck pulled away, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the street. A sense of gathering tension thickened the air, a quiet storm curling tighter with each passing moment. The officers had warned me she would escalate. But even they couldn't have predicted how far Karen was willing to go to reclaim her version of power. And deep down, I knew her most dangerous move still hadn't arrived. The real retaliation was coming. And it would hit harder than anything yet. The morning of the emergency HOA hearing carried a different weight than the ordinary tension Karen created in the neighborhood. It felt heavier, thicker, almost ceremonial, like the community had unknowingly stepped into a drama far larger than its manicured lawns and orderly sidewalks. The sky was overcast, casting a muted gray across the cul-de-sac, as though even the weather sensed the conflict brewing beneath the surface. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp at the community center, a beige brick building usually reserved for potlucks and quiet gatherings. Today it resembled a courthouse. Cars lined the lot with unusual density, neighbors filing inside with hushed murmurings, carrying curiosity, concern, and an unspoken question lingering between them. How had things escalated so far? Inside, the air was warm and stale, thick with the smell of old carpet and tension. Folding chairs filled the room in tight rows. The HOA board sat at the front behind a long table, papers stacked neatly before them. Their expressions ranged from worried to uncomfortable, each aware that this hearing was far beyond the scope of typical community affairs. And then there was Karen. She stood at the front, poised like a prosecutor ready to seize her moment. Her hair was styled immaculately, her HOA badge polished to a reflective gleam. She clutched a binder swollen with documents, proof she believed would justify every action she had taken. Her stance radiated confidence, forced, brittle confidence, but strong enough to project authority to those willing to accept it. As I entered, conversations stilled. Some neighbors nodded respectfully. Others looked away, torn between social pressure and personal opinion. Karen's eyes met mine with a thin smile, cold, triumphant, expecting victory. The board chair, Mr. Wallace, cleared his throat as he called the meeting to order. He was an older man with a gentle voice, someone who preferred peaceful resolutions. But today, even he seemed aware that no peace would come easily. We are gathered to address several concerns raised regarding community safety and conduct, he said. We ask that all statements be respectful and factual. Respectful and factual, two traits Karen rarely embraced. She stepped forward immediately, flipping open her binder with theatrical purpose. Members of the board, residents, she began, we have a serious issue within this neighborhood. Car of unknown authorization has been parked here for months. Its presence has created fear, uncertainty, and disruption. Several neighbors exchanged confused glances. Fear, uncertainty, disruption. Most hadn't even noticed the car until Karen made it her crusade. She continued, voice swelling with conviction. Despite multiple warnings, the owner refused to comply with community standards. He intimidated HOA leadership, involved law enforcement unnecessarily, and has now endangered the harmony of our neighborhood. Her words twisted the truth like a skillful manipulator, reshaping reality into the narrative she needed. And with each lie, she grew bolder. I have gathered evidence, she said, raising a stack of papers dramatically. Here are photographs of the vehicle parked in violation. Emails documenting repeated non-compliance. Witness statements describing aggressive behavior. Witness statements? That caught my attention. Karen's gaze shifted toward a row of familiar faces, neighbors who had once avoided her scrutiny, now sitting rigidly under her influence. Whether coerced or simply exhausted by her persistence, they avoided eye contact, staring down at folded hands in their laps. And, she continued, I have prepared a motion that the owner be required to remove the vehicle immediately and be placed under HOA review for disruptive conduct. She placed her binder on the table with a satisfying thud, folding her arms as if expecting applause. The board listened in silence, their expressions tightening with discomfort. They knew Karen's reputation. They knew her talent for dramatization. But the structure of HOA politics required them to hear her out, regardless of how distorted the claims were. Mr. Wallace nodded stiffly. "Thank you, Karen. We will now hear from the homeowner in question." All eyes turned toward me. I stood, feeling the weight of the room but not intimidated by it. Years of enforcement work had taught me how to read crowds, how to present truth clearly, and how to maintain composure under pressure. "My car is a department-issued vehicle," I began. "It is legally registered, authorized for residential parking, and exempt from the rule Karen is referencing. I am a sworn officer, serving this community and this county for over a decade. My vehicle is not a threat. It is a tool for public safety." A ripple of realization moved through the room. Some neighbors leaned forward, processing the information. Others exchanged shocked looks, as though hearing this for the first time, because Karen had ensured they wouldn't hear it earlier. I continued. "The police were involved only because Karen contacted emergency services under false pretenses, claiming I was impersonating law enforcement. That misuse is now under departmental review." Karen's posture stiffened. I let a quiet moment settle before adding, "My goal is not conflict. My goal is to live peacefully among my neighbors. But peace cannot exist when authority is misused and accusations are fabricated." Silence weighed heavily on the chairs, the carpet, the ceiling. Even Karen's confidence wavered slightly. Mr. Wallace rubbed his temples. "Karen," he said gently, "did you know the homeowner was a law enforcement officer?" Her jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter. Rules are rules. But the rule exempting government vehicles. It applies to marked vehicles," she snapped. "Not undercover ones. Not questionable ones." "It applies to both," I said calmly. Karen glared at me, her carefully built argument collapsing piece by piece. She sensed it. The room sensed it. And desperation flickered in her eyes, sharp and sudden. "This is outrageous," she shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "You're all being manipulated. This is how rules erode. This is how chaos starts. If we let one person break standards, everyone will." Her voice echoed through the room. People shifted uncomfortably, some shrinking back from the intensity. Even the board members seemed startled. Mr. Wallace raised his hand. "Enough, Karen. Please." But Karen wasn't listening. She stood taller, fueled by the panic of losing control. "If the board won't take action," she said, trembling with fury, "then I will. I'll protect this neighborhood myself." Her words filled the room with a chilling finality. And as she stared me down, eyes burning with hostility, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't about a car anymore. This was about power. And Karen wasn't done fighting for it. The days following the chaotic HOA hearing unfolded with a strange mixture of calm and unease, like the quiet air before a severe storm. Outwardly, the neighborhood returned to its regular rhythms. Sprinklers ticking across lawns, dogs barking in fenced yards, residents walking their usual morning loops. Yet beneath the familiar surface, tension pulsed steadily, fed by whispered conversations and unread emails piling inside inboxes. Everyone sensed something had shifted. Everyone sensed something was coming. Karen had left the hearing in a state of visible fury, her binder clutched tightly, her posture rigid, her footsteps sharp enough to echo across the parking lot. She hadn't spoken directly to the board after her final outburst, nor had she acknowledged the neighbors who avoided her gaze. Instead, she walked away with the look of someone who refused to accept defeat. Someone preparing for retaliation in silence. For 2 days, her home remained still. Curtains closed. Car unmoved. Porch empty. The absence of her presence became unnerving. When people like Karen grew quiet, it wasn't peace, it was planning. And no one knew what form her plan would take. On the third evening, I noticed something unusual. A faint flicker of blue light glowed behind her living room curtains, shifting steadily like the pulsing of a screen. At first, it seemed insignificant, someone watching television. But the glow remained constant for hours, never changing brightness or rhythm. It wasn't entertainment. It was work. Karen was compiling something. The following morning, neighbors found new flyers on their porches, unmarked, distributed at dawn. They were printed on thick paper, containing bold statements about neighborhood infiltration, hidden authorities, and violations disguised as rights. The language was grandiose, theatrical, almost delusional. Though my name wasn't directly printed, the implication was unmistakable. She claimed the community had been compromised by covert operations, insisting residents must take back control through unity and decisive action. It was beyond petty retaliation now. It was a crusade built on paranoia and wounded pride. And she was pulling the neighborhood into her spiral. Some flyers were tossed immediately. Others were read quietly behind closed doors. And a few made their way onto the community message board, tacked by unknown hands. The atmosphere thickened with confusion and doubt. Karen knew how to weaponize uncertainty. She was no longer targeting only me. She was targeting anyone who failed to align with her. That afternoon, I received an email from Mr. Wallace requesting a brief meeting. His tone was tired, his words careful. The board was worried. They'd received a flood of messages, some supporting Karen, some demanding the board restrain her, others simply asking for clarity. The community was dividing, splintering under pressure. When I arrived at the community center, I found him pacing, wringing his hands. "She's pushing for a recall election of the entire board," he said. "She claims we're complicit in misconduct. She's gathering signatures door to door again." I nodded slowly. "She won't stop until someone stops her." He looked at me, concern clouding his eyes. "She believes you're the root of everything. But this isn't just about you anymore. She's destabilizing the whole community." The board couldn't do much without risking further escalation. They were volunteers, neighbors, not bureaucrats. And Karen, armed with righteous indignation, was overwhelming them. I left the meeting sensing a new urgency in the situation. Karen's obsession had evolved into something larger, something dangerous. Her behavior wasn't merely entitled, it was escalating into instability. That night, around 9 o'clock, I stepped outside to take out the trash. The air was cool, the moon hidden behind a veil of drifting clouds. As I walked toward the bins, a rustling noise drew my attention. Beyond the fence line, near the shadowed corner of my property, a figure moved, tense, deliberate, trying to stay concealed. My pulse sharpened instantly. The figure stepped forward into dim light. Karen. She clutched a clipboard and a small flashlight, her face set in tight determination. She examined the side of my property as though inspecting for violations visible only to her. Her movements were brisk, almost frantic. "What are you doing on my property?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. She flinched at being caught, but her expression hardened quickly, fueled by defiance. "This is an inspection," she snapped. "Your property is under review. You brought danger into this neighborhood. I'm ensuring compliance." She lifted her clipboard and began writing rapidly, as though documenting invisible infractions. The beam of her flashlight flickered across my driveway, porch, gutters, searching for anything she could twist into wrongdoing. "You have no authority to be here," I said. "I have every authority," she hissed. "If the HOA won't enforce standards, then I will. And I will make sure everyone knows who you really are." Her breath came fast, uneven. The rationality she once wielded as her greatest weapon was slipping. This was no longer calculated control. It was unraveling. Then she took a step too far. She crossed deeper onto my property. Her flashlight beam scanned my department-issued vehicle again, lingering on the license plate, the windshield, the interior through the glass. "You hid behind that badge for years," she muttered. "But I see through you now. You're not here to protect anyone. You're here to intimidate, to spy, to infiltrate my neighborhood." her neighborhood. The possessiveness was chilling. I reached for my phone, not to record, but to prepare for whatever her next move might be. Karen saw the gesture and stiffened. "You think calling the police will help you?" she spat. "They won't protect you forever. They won't protect someone who abuses authority." Her voice cracked slightly. She was crumbling, collapsing under the weight of the narrative she had created but could no longer control. Then she stepped back, her expression darkening with a resolve that sent a ripple of dread through the air. "You leave me no choice," she said, each word trembling with conviction. "If the system won't remove you, then I will." She backed away slowly, her flashlight trailing across the ground before disappearing into the night. And as the darkness swallowed her retreating silhouette, one truth settled uneasily in my chest. Karen wasn't preparing another complaint. Karen was preparing something far more dangerous. The night unfolded with a kind of eerie stillness that amplifies every sound, every motion, every shift in the air. I had barely slept after Karen's late-night intrusion onto my property. Her words replayed in my mind on a constant loop: "If the system won't remove you, then I will." It wasn't a statement of frustration anymore. It was a declaration of intent. And people who spoke from obsession were unpredictable, especially when they believed themselves righteous. The following day passed quietly, almost deceptively so. Karen's house remained closed off, its curtains drawn, its driveway empty. No flyers appeared. No sudden knocks echoed through the neighborhood. No signs of her patrolling the sidewalks. But the silence she left behind wasn't peaceful. It was charged, like an atmosphere bracing for lightning. Neighbors felt it too. Conversations grew short, doors stayed closed, and people lingered indoors rather than risk crossing her path. By evening, a heavy fog crept into the community, settling low across the lawns. Streetlights glowed through the haze in muted halos, creating an otherworldly stillness. The fog carried a dampness that clung to clothes and skin, masking distant sounds until they seemed distorted, closer than they truly were. It was in that unsettling quiet that I finally felt something shift. Around 10:15 p.m. the sound of footsteps approached slowly, not on the sidewalk, but directly across my lawn. Soft, controlled, intentional. The kind of footsteps someone takes when they don't want to be heard. I rose from my chair and looked out the window, catching only a faint silhouette moving through the fog. A figure approaching the side of my house. Karen. She wore dark clothing, her hair pulled back tightly, her posture tense. She held something in her hand, a small object, unidentifiable through the haze but carried with purpose. She moved with a strange combination of determination and frantic urgency, as though she had convinced herself this was her mission. Her responsibility, her burden to carry. I stepped outside quietly, approaching her with measured caution. She didn't notice me at first. She was too focused, too consumed by her task. Her flashlight remained off this time. She didn't want visibility, she wanted secrecy. When she finally turned and saw me standing there, the fog swirling between us, her eyes widened, not from fear, but from a kind of wild vindication. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered sharply. "Not anymore. Not after everything you've done." Her voice trembled, yet her posture remained rigid, as though she had built a fragile, collapsing fortress around her delusion. "I live here," I said calmly. "You're trespassing again." She shook her head, rejecting reality with a swift flicker of refusal. "No. Not trespassing. Inspecting. Protecting. You've endangered this community. You've deceived us all." The object in her hand shifted slightly, catching a faint glint of light. It was a keychain-sized canister, pepper spray, modified with an extended nozzle. An escalation. "I know what you're planning," she said, her voice rising. "I know what that car means. I know who you really work for." There was no logic in her words anymore, only the spiraling certainty of someone whose narrative had overtaken their grasp of truth. "I'm a traffic officer," I reminded her calmly. "Nothing more." She stepped closer, her breathing uneven. "You're lying. You're here to monitor us, to control us, to infiltrate our private lives." Her hand tightened around the canister. "This ends tonight. The fog thickened, sliding between us like a curtain. I took a step back instinctively, assessing the situation, recognizing the danger in her posture. She wasn't thinking. She wasn't listening. She wasn't grounded in reality. She was acting on fear, fear she had created herself, fed by her own anger and isolation. Suddenly, she lunged forward, raising the canister with shaking determination. It happened fast. Too fast for her to fully control. She stumbled on the wet grass, her own momentum carrying her off balance. The canister slipped from her hand, skidding across the ground with a sharp metallic scrape. She grabbed for it desperately, but her foot caught the edge of a low garden border. She pitched forward, collapsing hard onto the damp lawn with a jarring thud. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. For a moment, silence filled the neighborhood again. When she tried to stand, her legs quivered. She was disoriented, her obsession dissolving into confusion. Lights flicked on in houses nearby. Curtains shifted. Doors cracked open. The neighborhood had been quiet, but not asleep. They had heard her shouting. They had sensed the tension. Now they watched, uncertain and alarmed. Karen looked around, her gaze darting from face to face. What she saw wasn't support. It wasn't fear. It wasn't admiration. It was concern. It was pity. It was realization. Her power, everything she had built, crumbled in the span of those few seconds. When the police arrived minutes later, responding to multiple calls from concerned neighbors, Karen's posture slumped. Her defiance evaporated. She sat on the curb, arms wrapped around herself, staring blankly at the fog-thickened street. Her voice had lost its sharpness. Her eyes carried a hollow emptiness, a stark contrast to the fire she wielded only nights before. The officers spoke to her gently, recognizing her distress. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't entitlement. It was fragility. And fragility required care. When they helped her to her feet and guided her into the cruiser for evaluation, no one cheered. No one mocked. The neighborhood watched in heavy silence, aware they'd witnessed a collapse rather than a victory. As the lights faded into the distance, the fog thinned slowly, peeling away from houses and lawns, revealing a street finally cleared of tension. For the first time in weeks, the air felt light again. Normal. In the quiet that followed, neighbors stepped outside, approaching cautiously, offering supportive nods and relieved smiles. The storm had broken. And though the scars left behind would take time to fade, the neighborhood finally felt like a community again. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this chapter had closed, not with triumph, but with clarity. Karen's war wasn't about me. It was about her losing control of herself. And the neighborhood, at last, could breathe again.